This is the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center. This is part of our Star Criminal Justice series. And today is a panel discussion about innovations in rural prosecution. We have three fabulous panelists: Dustin Boyd, Andrea Harrington, and of course, Jarvis Parsons. And we're going to be talking with all of them. But first, I wanted to give you all a little bit of information about the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center. We're located in Dallas at SMU. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we do. We have three primary areas of focus. One is public defense, one is prosecution, particularly in the area of charging, and one is star criminal justice. That's small, tribal, and rural criminal justice systems. And in particular, I want to talk a minute about how we define small, tribal, and rural, because I'm sure some of y'all are looking and saying, well, what's Brazos County doing on here at all? So we see this as a pretty big tent. We think a lot about the way criminal justice systems work, not the way counties work or cities work, but about the way justice systems work. And so in our view, a criminal justice system is at least partly a small tribal or rural criminal justice system. It has three factors that are at play in how it functions. One is long distances or isolation, right? Between stakeholders, between communities, long distance sometimes from resources like treatment or therapy services. We think about legal deserts, small scale criminal justice systems where there may not be enough lawyers locally to cover all your legal needs. You may have to import lawyers from places other than your own community, or you may struggle to have conflict-free representation. You might struggle to get enough lawyers to be able to cover your physical territory, depending on how much distance you have. And lastly, these tend to be low volume systems, but by which we mean that the scale of justice is often smaller. And therefore you can't take advantage of economies of scale, fewer cases, fewer opportunities to, for example, hold court every day or have a grand jury in session every day. Maybe harder to create specialty courts, for example, if you don't have enough court sessions meeting regularly, et cetera. And so when we think about this at the Deason Center, one of the things we think about is the idea that lots of criminal justice systems will have rural components and urban components. Brazos would be a good example, right? You have a big college town and College Station, and then you have some communities that are entirely rural, very isolated, very small. And the challenge, of course, for a practitioner in that community is coming up with policies and practices that work in all of those places, so that justice is provided even-handedly across a variety of urban and rural communities. So let me introduce our speakers today. And I have to say, this has been so much fun for me, getting to know these folks and hearing about their programs. This is part of why I have the best job in the world, is I'm learning so much new stuff. But this panel in particular, I'm so excited about. So I'm gonna just tell you who our panelists are, and then I'm gonna introduce each one as I ask them to speak. So our first panelist is Dusty Boyd, who's the district attorney in Coryell County. And one of the really fun parts about doing these, you get to learn things about people you didn't know. And since I get to pick and choose what of the bio I'm telling the parts that I think are fascinating. So I can tell you the usual stuff, which is that Dusty grew up in Texas on the McElroy Ranch outside of Crane, went out to Michigan to go to law school and social work school, practiced law, including in Coryell County, but wait for it, went overseas in 2007 with the United Nations mission in Sudan, where he was a legal advisor for peacekeeping operations, worked in human rights violations, special investigations of human rights abuses, came home in 2008, began working as an assistant district attorney, and was elected in 2013. First to tell us a little bit about his county, and then we'll turn to some of the innovations he's been working on. Dusty, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Pam. I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this forum and this webinar this afternoon. So I'm the district attorney here in Coryell County, which is a small rural county, centrally located in Texas. It's approximately about 75,000 people. We're just off the I-35 corridor in Central Texas, outside of Waco and Temple, about an hour north of Austin, about 2.5 hours south of Dallas. About 75,000 people. A third of our geographic landmass is actually a federal military installation. Fort Hood is located in my county. At least a third of it is. The landmass of Fort Hood is effectively in Coryell County. I have three what I call three major law enforcement agencies. One is out of Copper's Cove, which is my largest community that I serve, is approximately 35,000 people. And then I have Gatesville, where the county seat is, and it's approximately 8 to 10,000 people. And then I have the Coryell County Sheriff's Department, which serves the rest of the county outside of Copper's Cove and Gatesville. And we have a lot of different other rural communities kind of scattered throughout the county. So that's kind of the lay of the land of where we're at and kind of how I'm situated.
Dustin,
Like I
how
said,
many lawyers are in your office?
I have 12 employees and I have 4 assistant district attorneys.
Okay.
And they're each divided based on specialty. I have a domestic crimes, sexual assault prosecutor, property crimes prosecutor, white collar crimes prosecutor, narcotics prosecutor. And then unlike a lot of district attorneys, I actually have my caseload and I go to court too. So I have 4 assistants that help me. Each assistant has their own legal assistant or paralegal, and we have 1 investigator in the office.
Cool, thanks. So I'm going to ask the same question of Andrea and Jarvis before we start talking about innovations. Jarvis, a different kind of Texas.
Absolutely. Jarvis Parsons here, Brazos County, Texas, originally Louisiana native from Lake Charles, but Brazos County is between Houston, an hour and a half from Houston, an hour and a half from Austin, about 3 hours from Dallas. So we are in the middle of Aggie land. So Texas A&M University, about 220,000 people here, 225,000, give or take 70 or 80,000 students every fall and spring. So our area kind of swells and decreases during the summer. But it is an interesting jurisdiction because we do have some rural areas and some more suburban areas. We have 2 really big cities, Bryan and College Station, and then rural areas that kind of around that. To try to think in terms of staff, I have 22 lawyers and a staff of about 42 total. And so I handle felony cases, juvenile cases, and cases that involve child protective services. So we kind of have a little bit of a different thing. There's a separate person that handles misdemeanors, but because of our jurisdiction and we're a little bit of a faster moving jurisdiction, so a little bit more crime. Not saying our crime is different than Dusty's, but we just have a little bit more of it over here in Bryan College Station.
Okay. Andrea, you're up. Andrea Harrington, Berkshire, Massachusetts.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. I am from Western Massachusetts. I did attend college for 2 years in Texas.
I didn't do your introductions yet. That's right. I was going to do you guys when I asked your questions.
Oh, well, I'll answer the questions, but I just wanted to put that out there. I loved being in Texas. People were so warm and friendly and kind. It was a big culture shock from being in Massachusetts. So very happy to be here. So Berkshire County consists of about 125,000 people. We have 32 cities and towns, a couple small cities, a lot of small towns. We have a mix of urban and rural problems. We have gun violence here. We have a lot of serious drug trafficking going on. 6% of the population here is addicted to opioids. We have a hollowed out, manufacturing economy. We have some of the highest domestic violence rates in the state. And all of the characteristics that Pam talked about and what makes a rural area like a rural office, like we fit all of those characteristics. Transportation is difficult, people are isolated, there's just lower resourced, we don't have near enough substance use disorder treatment or mental health treatment. So, it's a big challenge and one that I've been meeting for the last 2 years.
Thanks, y'all. All right, so now I'm mortified because I said I was going to do one thing and then I did another, so bad on me. So let me go ahead. I'm going to introduce Jarvis and Andrea now. I'll take it out of the way I was going to do it, and we'll come back. So Andrea, who y'all just heard from, as you probably now figured out, she's the chief prosecutor for Berkshire County, Massachusetts. She's also the first woman to hold that spot. And she's out in Western Massachusetts, which is actually where she's from, right? She's from Pittsfield, grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And really has grown up there, which is something we know to be true about a lot of people who wind up in rural and quasi-rural areas, right? They've grown up there, they've had a good experience there. And she really thinks a lot about domestic violence, the opioid crisis, as you've heard, as well as thinking about things that people often assume DAs don't worry about, like bail, sentencing, and how those things impact working people and their communities. That's something she has in common with our other panelists, including Jarvis. Jarvis was elected for Brazos County. I've boned up on this district attorney after being up in Maine, so he knows a little bit about the Northeast as well. Worked as a law clerk in New Jersey and has been in Brazos since 2002 at the district attorney's office there for almost 20 years now, right? Among other things, he's the chair of the board for the Texas District and County Attorneys Association. Served as Texas as chair there, been a member there for many years, and has also been part of a innovative campaign he's going to talk about a little bit today called Cut It Out, which looks at domestic violence in the context of training hairstylists to help and support those women. He's also done a lot of interesting work with TCDA and the National District Attorneys Association on issues of implicit bias in prosecution and how prosecutors can do better. He's going to talk to us a little more about that. So with that, I think what I'm going to do is ask you each to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that you've piloted. And since I'm here with Jarvis, I'm going to ask you to start by talking about the work you did around the topic of racial equity when the George Floyd protests started happening.
So yeah, that would be good. We when George Floyd happened, it was kind of rocked, obviously rocked the nation. But I had a prosecutor in my office ask me if I was ever going to speak up about that. Was I going to say anything about it? And I thought about it for a little bit, and I was just kind of, I don't know if the best word would be exhausted after just seeing like over and over and over again, seeing these images on TV. And so I decided to do something I normally don't do, and I put out a Facebook post. I usually don't use Facebook as kind of my diary, but it was one time I actually put out my thoughts. And I didn't realize that it kind of caught on, and people really started looking at it, and it had a ton of shares, and I had people calling me, and the local newspaper put it on in their they printed the whole thing, and so it was eye-opening to me in that sense that people actually cared about what my thoughts were on that topic. But one of the things that we did, we had been doing during this time, but one of the things that we also did was that we increased the amount of training we did on implicit bias, which was something we had started in 2019 and kind of just ramped up, where we were talking to prosecutors about what is cognitive bias when dealing with certain cases, but also how do we deal with certain people, and what are the reasons for inequities in the justice system, by focusing on studies that show that, but for one fact in these different studies, the outcomes are different. The responsibility that we give certain people are different based on a number of things, whether it be unconscious or conscious bias in the system, which I think if we get that right, if we can understand that one thing, it can lead to so much of a better outcome, and not just a better outcome in fact, but also the perception of better outcomes. The fact that we are talking about these issues that were so taboo before. And so I think in many areas, we aspired in our country to be more of a colorblind society. And what research is telling us, and what African Americans have known for a long time, is we all see color. That's just our vision. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about is how do we evaluate people, and where do we put them in boxes after we see their color? Mm-hmm. And so, colorblindness is the poor man's compliment to say, well, I'm not going to attach the negative attributes of your color to you. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to move towards is more of a color consciousness, where I appreciate all the different diversity that is around me. And so I think that's what the implicit bias tries to, we try to get at. We've seen a lot of success. We did it in Texas and a bunch of places. We've gone and done it in, Washington, D.C., Idaho, of all places, and it was a great experience. Mm-hmm. Did it in Maine for 70% of the DA's offices in Maine, and it was a really good experience. So I'm going to leave it right there.
Well, so thank you for kicking this off. These questions about race, about implicit bias, about what prosecutors to kind of deal with within themselves. And then the translation between prosecutors and their communities is one of the areas in which I think what all three of you have been doing is so very, very interesting. Dusty, can you talk about what you've done in this area to think both about race equity and transparency?
Sure. Much like what Jarvis was explaining, coming off the heels of George Floyd and the national narrative and the things and the images that we were seeing on our television sets and hearing on talk shows is, and actually what's interesting is I had struck up a conversation with a friend of mine from the African American community here in Gatesville several months before George Floyd, and we had just randomly saw each other at a local school function. I think it was a basketball game, middle school basketball game. And we started talking about how do we start building better relationships, trust, transparency between his community and law enforcement. And we came up with a couple of ideas about how to at least initiate and start that conversation. And then boom, the Floyd matter happened in Minnesota, and we really had to circle our wagons and figure out a different way to approach this in a more profound way. And it really struck me and it struck him in how we wanted to design and talk and create the platform for how we moved our county forward, our community forward. And so what I took out of that conversation with that community member was, we've got to do something. I'm old enough, everyone in this podcast, or I'm sorry, this webinar is old enough to know this has been something that has been spoken about for years and years and years. And we're ready just to do something and stop talking about it. So coming off the heels of that conversation with him, I kind of designed a plan a lot around kind of a program that I was engaged with when I was in Africa called co-locating. And what that meant was the attorneys that were with the mission in Sudan, along with international police officers, would go and co-locate at the local police stations throughout South Sudan. We would actually go and stay there all day and give advice and observations to their local law enforcement on perhaps better ways to do things and interact with people. And so my way of adapting that to here in Coryell County was, well, instead of my office going and co-locating into the community, how about we have the community come and co-locate within my office, much like a police ride-along. Is come see how this process works within my office. And so we came up with the platform MAPS, which is the acronym for the Minority Advisory Panel Support. It consists of 5 individuals from my jurisdiction. The platform we created for it, 3 of the individuals must be of the minority percentage here in the county, 2 of which can be at large. And so we have these 5 individuals who come into the office and co-locate with us. And the main mission of MAPS is to provide transparency, accountability, and to create trust and education between the judicial system for Coryell County and their communities. And so what I found really interesting about it is as much as we're teaching them about how the criminal justice process works here in Coryell County, we're learning just as much, if not more, about their community, their feelings, their thoughts, their history with law enforcement. And then we're trying to get an idea of how to navigate and make it better and how to create a way forward so that we can continue to build the trust, build the transparency and accountability. And when we're as educated or better educated by my local people, by my communities, then I can do a better job in serving justice for them. Because ultimately, in the end, justice from Berkshire County to Brazos County may look a little different than Coryell County because our juries are going to be made up of different people. And so if I'm getting better input from my people, then I'm in my opinion, I'm meeting their need for what they desire out of justice. And so I consider it much like a ride along with law enforcement. If anyone is aware of those kind of programs, they come and ride along with us. But the interesting thing is, I think we've enjoyed the ride with them maybe more than they have with us. So what's interesting is if anyone's familiar with the grand jury process in Texas, this group acts very much like a grand jury. They meet once a month in my office because that's how often my grand jury meets, because we are rural county. We don't meet every week. We meet once a month. The 5 members do have to pass a criminal history check. They can't have crimes of moral turpitude or felony convictions on their record. They do have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep the nature of the information that they're hearing in my office secret. We don't reveal the names of the cases of the suspects that they're getting discussed, so that they won't even know the names. They'll know the facts, they'll know the narrative, they'll know the scenario, they'll hear the evidence, but they don't actually hear the names of the individual. And that's consistent with us just being a smaller county. I mean, if I have an offense committed in Gatesville, everybody knows about it, right? So we don't want to disclose names, and we've asked them if they're familiar with the facts, or they've heard about a case that's consistent with the evidence, to pretty much effectively recuse themselves from the conversation, such that they would have some kind of a personal bias or be influenced one way or the other by what they've heard outside of the office. And so we begin these meetings by talking generally about topics within the criminal justice process, not necessarily about specific cases. We just talk about the criminal justice process, and then we just kind of ease into our cases. And each one of my attorneys presents their kind of cases to the panel, and they focus on 3 main areas. One, what was the law enforcement interaction with the suspect? Was it legal? Was it professional? Or were they treated with respect? What was the nature of the situation in terms of the heightened type of interaction that the law enforcement officer may have had to have with that individual? So that's the first thing they're looking at, is what is the nature of the interaction? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it professional? Is it not professional? And we're getting feedback from them on that one plank. The second plank is how my office screens these cases. What does the prosecutor consider in determining to go forward? And mind you, we don't just present the cases that we're going to go forward on. We also present them the ones that we're going to dismiss, because they need to know everything we have in the box. So they'll learn that we learn to try to understand their age, their youth, their education, their mental health issues, any substance abuse issues, their social economic background, what platforms that they lacked in their life that perhaps that we can consider when we're going to offer a probation or some other kind of program to try to resolve the case. So the panel really gets to kind of look behind the curtain on what exactly are we looking at. And of course, they also have to consider a whole nother dynamic, and that is the cases that involve victims, and understanding how the victim was impacted, what type of long-term, short-term impact this victim is suffering. They need to understand that. And at the end of the day, what's really interesting is, because they're not a grand jury, whereas if a grand jury tells me, Dusty, this is pretty much what you need to do, then I need to do it. This is more of a constructive platform for advice and opinions. And we told them up front, look, you can give us advice on what to do, but understand at the end of the day, I still have to make decisions of what I feel is best for the community. So they evaluate that second plank, which is how do we screen cases? And then thirdly, we talk about what is my individual attorney's intent on, what are they intending on how to resolve the case? Are they going to dismiss the case? Are they going to offer probation? Are we going to offer a pretrial diversion contract? Are we going to set this for trial and ask for a lot of years in prison? And we kind of break that down and explain, each one of my attorneys have an opportunity to explain that is why they're going to ask for that outcome. And we get their feedback from it. And again, one of the biggest questions I had at the very beginning of creating this panel is, well, Dusty, that's what you have a grand jury for. They tell you whether you go forward or not. But I try to explain to them, under Texas law, you don't get to deliberate with a grand jury. We go present a case, we leave, and they get to talk behind our backs and say, this case is great, this case is horrible, we don't like law enforcement on this, we don't like how the prosecutor presented this, whatever. This is a real opportunity for a give and take, and to really learn from each other. Yeah, Pam.
So first of all, this is incredibly fascinating. When we met as a group earlier to prepare for this panel, we were just all so blown away by this very interesting approach to transparency and to the co-location, right, of learning. And just thank you for sharing that. I wanted to just highlight here a couple of things that I think are so remarkably innovative about it. One is that it's a real effort on your part to go out and bring these folks in and expose things that you don't have to share. And so for those folks who are watching and may not be familiar with how DAs make their decision, secrecy can be the hallmark of a DA's decision making, and there's no obligation to share with anyone cutoff points or decisions about how you will or won't decline cases. And so it takes an enormous amount of faith in your community and in your line assistants, right, to put that out there and make that. It also is really, it's a just this very interesting, and I've never heard of it before, very innovative strategy for transparency. And one, may I point out, that's focused on racial justice and community transparency around race justice, that's in a rural county in Texas, where people might not think to look for innovation, let alone innovation on these topics. The flip side of that kind of informal one-to-one innovation and transparency is something Andrea is doing. Andrea is doing some data-driven transparency, and I'm working with some folks that we know over at Duke on this. Andrea, you want to talk about that project a little bit?
Yeah, so data is the big issue in criminal justice across the country, across the state. I ran on a kind of a reform platform. I was a career defense lawyer. I'd never prosecuted a case in my life before I became the DA. And now that we are talking about having evidence-based programming and decision-making processes, there's this new pressure for my office to justify the decisions that we're making and to demonstrate that what we are doing is fair and effective to the public in a way that really didn't exist for my predecessors. And it's a good thing. It certainly represents a big shift in the public interest and awareness about what's happening in criminal justice. So, in Massachusetts, we have a very antiquated case management system. We have very little capacity in my office to gather meaningful data. And this was an important promise that I made to the voters here in my community, and definitely the most difficult for me to deliver on. Massachusetts is known to be, a bastion of liberalism. We do have the lowest incarceration rates in the country here in Massachusetts. But when you look at the data and the statistics around how Black people and Latinx people are treated in the Massachusetts court system, there is huge racial disparities. So recently, Harvard University came out with a study looking at racial disparities in the Massachusetts court systems. And what they found was that Black and Latinx people who were sent to incarceration receive longer sentences than their white counterparts. Black people receive an average of 168 days longer sentences. Latinx people receive an average of 148 days longer. And they really found that racial and ethnic disparities were driving the disparities. It overshadowed all other factors, including criminal history, demographics, the court jurisdiction, the neighborhood characteristics. And they also found that Black and Latinx people were convicted of roughly equally severe charges, even though they faced more severe charges and they faced longer sentences. And there's been a lot of discussion since George Floyd about the role of police and our changing, expectations of police. And my office has led on this discussion by leading by example. And, I absolutely support police reform, but I'm very, very clear that prosecutors, courts, probation, we all have a role to play. So I've been really working in my office to be transparent around the kinds of decisions that we're making. So that, thank God for Duke University. They are helping us to develop a comprehensive data collection system, really looking at the discretionary decisions that we make around charging decisions and plea negotiations, because the belief is that this is where prosecutors really drive racially disparate sentences by the way we use our discretion. So we're going to be collecting comprehensive data on these factors using a survey created by Duke University. We're going to collect it on every case for a year, and we'll see, what we find out. I'm a little, I'm hoping that people are impressed that we're willing to gather the data and share it. But yeah, it's definitely, I'm certain, I know for sure that we're going to have significant racial disparities despite our best efforts, in our individual decision making.
Thank you, Andrea. And I can tell you, because the call I was on before this one was with Brandon Garrett at Duke, that they are excited about this project too. These two worlds, right? The face-to-face communication with representatives of the community and the DA's office, the data keeping, kind of, Jarvis is working on something that kind of brings you to both, right? Which is, what do you do when you get the data? And then you got to figure out, because it's not quite doing or saying what you thought it was going to do. And again, Jarvis has to do this more than I think either of our other two panelists, across some really, really diverse practice communities, right? You got two big communities, college town, and then some places that are really teeny tiny, but have to be served in the same way. So Jarvis, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we have started looking at, we were working with an academic right now, kind of just trying to figure out, okay, let's look at 18 months of our dispositions, and let's figure out, do we have some sort of bias there? And which is kind of hard, because as a prosecutor, you are elected. And so it takes a certain amount of, okay, this is what we're going to do, and realize that what you're making is not only a justice decision, but you're also possibly making a political decision, or a justice decision with possible political effects, right? So, but I think overall, what you kind of see is that, look, we're trying to make the right call. And the right call may mean that this decision may last longer than you in office, but it still makes it the right call. And so we're looking at our numbers right now. We are, like I said, we're working with an academic, and hopefully we'll be able to look at 18 months of data to see when we are having our cases, whether it be aggravated assaults or sexual assaults or aggravated robberies, are we overrepresented in some areas? One of the hallmarks that we tried to focus on in our world is domestic violence. And we've been keeping our own numbers on those. And what we've seen is that we've seen an overrepresentation in our own county numbers when it comes to African Americans in domestic violence cases, and trying to figure out why that is. So it was bothering me so much. I started doing research. And so I'm getting on Lexis, I'm looking at this thing. What I'm realizing is this is a problem not just in Brazos County, but nationwide. And then the next question becomes, okay, now we realize that there's a problem there. How are we going to fix it, right? And what I'm learning is that there's so many different factors that are institutional in nature when you start dealing with things such as underemployment or unemployment that lead to more violent outcomes. And then that's how does the DA's office then help solve problems that are inherently extrajudicial? So how do we get those things in there? So those are some of the areas that we're trying to figure out right now and work on, and figure out why in the African-American community, especially in my area, but also nationwide, many times African-American women are more likely to have more severe abuse, but also less likely to report. And what we've seen is many times our white victims are afraid that the police are going to under-prosecute, and that our Black victims are afraid, because of mass incarceration, that they're going to over-prosecute. So essentially, it's a double bind. They may not report, and the abuse may end up being more severe because it's been more continued because they don't report. And so how to solve those problems is kind of where we are. And we don't have the answer, but we're starting to ask the right questions.
So Jarvis, I'm going to pick up though. You said something that you mentioned that some of these though are require extrajudicial solutions, right? And so Dusty's got one extrajudicial approach, right? Which is, you guys come in, I've got the discretion as the DA, help me exercise it. Sometimes I'm going to take your advice, sometimes I'm not going to take your advice, but we're going to have a conversation. You took a different approach back in 2013, 2014, and you brought the community in a different way with the Cut It Out campaign. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. And so what we realized is that violent crime is about 20% of our pie in terms of crime in our area. Within that 20% pie, domestic violence makes up about 65 to 70% of it. So if we were looking at data, that's where we need to throw our numbers, and we needed to find ways to try to get to people so that they didn't just come through the judicial system. That takes a long time to get through. We're trying to solve that problem before it gets there. So it just so happens, I know it doesn't look like it, but I know a lot of hairstylists. I don't know why, but I do. And so I saw the program and it was on the website somewhere in Arizona. I heard about it and I just called them and said, hey, can we do this? And it's basically teaching salon professionals, hairstylists, and beauty professionals about the signs and symptoms of domestic violence, because the research basically says that many times abusers will let their spouses go to the gynecologist and to the hair salon by themselves. And so if a person who is a hairstylist sees something that causes them to think that something may be going on or feel something in their hair, then they can discreetly give something to their client, to where there is either a national domestic hotline or a local domestic violence hotline, where they can go and maybe get safety planning and hopefully get out of those situations before they ever come to our office. So it's kind of one of those things that is hard to quantify because you can't really tell who's not coming. But what we found was two things. One, that it put us on the map that's in the area saying they care about domestic violence. And two, we started getting calls that may not have come from hair salons saying, okay, I heard y'all care, here's what's going on. And so it increased the amount of people we were sending to our county attorney's office for protective orders, safety planning to our local domestic violence shelters. So it's having kind of a multiplier effect of what we do in the courtroom, and that we can't ever replicate. And so who knows how many people we've helped with the program. We've trained over 200 stylists and a ton of other people who are going through like hair salon school. But I think it's a good program, and I think it's worth it to, as long as the more people know about signs and symptoms of domestic violence, the more they can help their family, their friends, their clients, and their coworkers.
And Jarvis, do you have any sense about whether in more rural communities where the hairstylist may be one of the fewer businesses that you're going to reliably have open and available, whether it's had an impact in those places?
All I can tell you is from the people that that I know personally that have been hairstylists, they've talked about having their eyes open, sometimes a little too open, because they were ready to go, and one of them was ready to go and beat a husband up because he was there with his wife, and I think she just had surgery or something like that. But they're like, why is he here with her? So what's going on? And they were on high alert at that time. But they all loved the program, and I think that right there, if they are jazzed about the program, that means they're jazzed about stopping domestic violence. And I think we've heard nothing but good things about the program. The only question is, when are you going to come back and teach it again? And so so that's good, and it's easy for a prosecutor to do. You can do it with hairstylists. Corpus Christi took our idea and did it a little bit different. They did it with barbershops and talking about adding men to domestic violence. And so they kind of take that and they copied it, and they did a permutation, and it was great. And so copy all you want, do it as much as you want, and as long as the message is out there, I'm happy.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks, Jarvis. So we have a couple of questions, and let me let folks in the audience know that we're going to be taking the questions. They'll be filtered through to us, and I'll be able to ask the panelists about them. Dusty, we've had a question about how you select your panel members, and I'm gonna add onto that and ask you if you could also say a word about what it is you think you've learned most from your panel members.
I want to make sure I didn't interfere with Jarvis.
That's right. At least you're not a cat.
Yeah, remember I'm an Aggie, so I've still got to know how to punch the right button, right, Jarvis? But no, I beat you to the punch a little bit, because I did respond to that anonymous listener about how the office chooses, and it's really, really important that it's clear that we do not choose our volunteers. My biggest concern was to make it look like I control the panel members that come in, because it's a small community that I'm controlling who comes in, who gets to hear what. And so effectively what we did when we kicked off MAPS, we had two big community meetings. The first one was kind of to roll out the platform and what we wanted from the MAPS program. And then we told them, go out, bring other people who'd be interested in this. And we had a second larger community meeting. And at that meeting, we solicited our first volunteers. We said, we would like our first 5. And only subject to a criminal history background check because of the nature of the sensitive information they're going to be hearing. Subject to that, they get to participate. Right now, we're still kind of working with the lengths of the term. In Texas, the grand jury term is 6 months. My panel, we started with a 4-month term, but my panel's telling me they want to stay on longer, especially because of COVID. And I think they're enjoying the program. And so once we have a turnover from whatever term we decide the number will be, then we just go next down the list down the volunteers. But there is no application process. We just ask for volunteers, and just they understand they're subject to a criminal history and background check, and they'll get to participate. And that's really, really important if I'm really wanting to get to the heart of transparency. Because in rural communities, if the narrative is, or even the appearance is, that we're just picking and choosing the people we want, then we're not getting anything done. So that's how the process works. And I know our local paper just did an article about it. At the very end, I'm yelling and screaming, we need volunteers. We want people, we want to have a waiting list. And the only thing that's required is to have a clear criminal history. That's it.
Now I'm on you. I'm gonna push you on that, Dusty, because someone else has asked and it's been on my mind. How come you got to have a clear criminal history? Do you think there's would you consider putting someone on there who had been justice involved? And if not, why not?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's people, I mean, under Texas law, you can still participate in a jury so long as you're not, under indictment or felony conviction or crime of moral turpitude. So, I mean, if you have a felony history with something outside of those parameters, but when we designed the program, I really kind of mirrored what the code was for participating in a regular jury in Texas. But you got to understand that these folks come in into my office, and they're actually personally with my staff. And so we do need to have a clear understanding of who we're working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was number one. I'm pretty much mirrored what the code requires under jury service in Texas. And so it's not necessarily that you can't have a criminal history. You can. It's just the ones that are specifically articulated in the Texas Criminal Code. That's just how we tracked it, because this has never been done. That's just the language that I kind of adopted.
And that's not something that would be clear to everyone across the country, because most places in the country, any criminal conviction disqualifies you from jury duty. So that was,
Sure.
I think that helps explain it.
And to be honest with you, as we expand, as we continue to look at, because the mission or the idea is the 20,000 foot view is to expand this past just minority cases, but also allow them to consider all the cases that we're screening that we're going to take to grand jury. And we would enjoy having, and I think the whole idea, the purpose of this platform is to have people with criminal history so that we can understand what their experience is like, and is there anything we can do to adjust, learn, conform to make it better for the next person. So it's not that we're not, that it's a brick wall and that we have no intention of ever expanding who can participate, but that's just where we started at.
Thanks, Dusty. So I'm going to skip over to Andrea, because there was a question for Andrea about how your lawyers, a couple questions about your data, but in addition to what data points you're collecting, how did your lawyers handle being told that they were going to have to do information entry for every case? And in particular, I think in the context of STAR jurisdictions, we're always thinking about the balance between how much work your lawyers can do and how much work they already have on their plates.
That's the biggest challenge about this project. We have 21 ADAs in my office. We've done some beta testing, but in order for this program to be successful, we've determined that we really need to have a staff person who is inputting any pieces of data that don't actually have to be input by the assistant district attorney handling the case, so that we can lessen that load. But that's the biggest challenge about collecting the data. And some of the points, I mean, one of the, we are certainly collecting race and ethnicity information in regards to defendants, but also in regards to victims. Like if you look at the Baldus study, which was a seminal study on the influence of race and who gets the death penalty, the race of the victim has drives who gets the death penalty, more than any other factor. So we, expect that could very well be the case in other kinds of crime, and particularly violent crime. So we're collecting a lot of victim-centered information. What did the victim want? What were their wishes? How involved were they? How hurt were they by the crime? We're collecting, was the initial charge, dropped down as part of a plea negotiation? We really want to track, we want to make sure that we get credit, because we do that a lot. We want to make sure that we get credit for all of those kinds of concessions that we make. We're tracking, what was the initial offer? What was the rationale behind the offer? What did the defense counter with? What did the court ultimately impose? But yeah, definitely we're going to need some administrative support for our ADAs to effectively track all this information.
Jarvis, I'm gonna ask you the same question. When folks in your office found out that y'all were going to be collecting and studying data, what was the reaction?
The weird part is that most of them, we didn't even talk about it. So the things that we are tracking are dispositions. So it's already done. And so we have given that off to another person. And then for my grant, I have a domestic violence and sex assault chief, and she tracks that data for her grant. And so sex assaults and domestic violence, we have been tracking that for about 4 or 5 years. We're just starting to look at it and analyze it in light of the bias stuff. And so I wanted to have it as cold in a sense of hit them as cold as possible to say, okay, is there bias here? And that there's no sort of Hawthorne effect, i.e. I know that somebody's watching over my shoulder. Right. I want to see exactly what it is. And then once we see it, then we can actually solve for it without any sort of, well, is somebody actually changing what they're normally doing? So we got our 18 months of data. It's already over with the academic. And so we should have something back probably in May about that type of bias.
So it's interesting, that you're thinking about, does knowing we're tracking and looking at this kind of change our behaviors, right?
Right.
And I'm curious from all three of you, what is your sense as lawyers who are practicing in communities that are smaller, right? Where people do feel, I think in many ways, some kind of closer kinship or some expectation of a closer relationship with their elected officials. What do you think your constituents are taking away, and what are you taking away from how your constituents are responding to these efforts? What are you learning about what they value in innovation from your offices?
I'll go first. I think that for the most part, I think that people are happy that we are tackling the subject and tackling it with data, tackling it with studies, tackling it without just having anecdotal evidence, but actually saying, here's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to dig deeper. There always is going to be some pushback from people who think that there is not a problem, or why are you doing this? Or for me, like, see, we knew that this was going to be something that you were going to be doing. And I will tell you, when we did our implicit bias talks around the state of Texas, there were a couple of places, people who were not happy that we were doing it. By and large, they were. And so I think it's just kind of one of those things that I think it's generational. So the younger that we went, the more they were like, yeah, we know all this stuff. Why are we dealing with this? And the older generation that we saw in certain conferences had a little bit of an issue. And so it was kind of one of those things where, well, here's what we're doing. And if you think that something is different, you're more than welcome to find some research that says that there's not bias in the system. And so I actually had a guy stand up and try to, I don't know if the right word is, shout me down in a talk at a conference. And it was so crazy that a lot of people thought he was a plant. And I was like, well, that's a really good plant. But yeah, that happened in a particular case. But by and large, it's been good for us.
Okay. Andrea, are you getting feedback from your constituents about how they feel with this?
Well, I'll say that, once the community response to the George Floyd incident kind of took hold and became part of the dialogue and the discourse, it really opened up the possibilities for my office in what we can do. And everything that we do is driven by the community and community support. I try to build consensus and lead on these issues, but I can't do it without support from my community. And another point I'd like to make is that once the courts started to track data and track racial disparities. And that study I talked about previously was commissioned by the Chief Justice of our Supreme Judicial Court. It's changing the culture in the judiciary. Judges now, I think, are recognizing that their advancement in their careers and their reputations are going to depend on how they respond to this data. And I think prosecutors in my office are catching on as well.
Okay, so Dusty, you've already talked about this a little bit, but I'll go back to a question I asked you before. What's been your big takeaway from this kind of enhanced transparency with your community in this very direct way about cases?
I think my biggest takeaway, speaking on behalf of the panel, I think their biggest takeaway is encouragement. I think my office and the minority community that's engaged are very encouraged. It's still very early on. We just started this last year, but every meeting begins with great information and great stories, very personal stories related to criminal justice and their life experience. And I think this platform has created a lot of encouragement. And that's kind of the feedback I get from my communities and my constituents is, hey, what's this about? What's going on with this? I'll just tell you, last October, we did one of my first jury trials that I was involved with since COVID and since we started MAPS. And one of the board hour members, one of the potential jurors had raised her hand in terms of, when we asked who knows the district attorney, well, one of them had actually already heard about the MAPS program and actually discussed in his opinion that how encouraged he was about the system opening up a dialogue and a platform for them to have an opportunity to have a voice. And so I think that's the takeaway, not only from the panel and from my constituents and the community as a whole, but there's a whole other flip side of this, and this is my staff. My assistant district attorneys absolutely love this, and they are very encouraged to have engaged in substantive conversations with members of the minority community about the nature of how law enforcement interacted in their cases, how they're screening their cases, and what the projected outcome may be of the case. And so the word that I fall back on is encouraged. We're very encouraged and in a way excited to see where it goes.
Thank you. So there's another question in the chat, and I'm going to kind of morph it and put it into my own words here, but there were questions about academic partners. And I'm going to make it a kind of a broader question. I'm going to ask this. Historically, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years, the focus on prosecution has come primarily on the coasts and in big cities. It's what are prosecutors in big cities doing, right? What are they doing in New York and Chicago? But that's not, as we all know on this webinar, where the action is, right? That's not where the vast majority of people are living their lives and experiencing the criminal justice system. And so there's a question about, how do you connect with an academic community if you're in a small or tribal or rural community? How do prosecutors who are interested in research or reform make their way to, whether it's nonprofits or universities who are available? And I'm going to, for the academics who are on this call who are licking their chops and wondering how they can get at your data, first of all, back off. But, what do they need to know? So Dusty, I'm going to start with you. How did you end up with us? I know, but everyone else doesn't. How did you
end up with Deason?
Talking to us about this? Yeah, how'd you end up to come to us with this idea?
Goodness, I guess it's been a year and a half, 2 years ago when I went to a conference there at SMU on campus about rural justice reform, and so I was very excited, interested in how the program there at SMU was interested in rural justice. And because like a lot of offices, as you spoke to, like in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, the bigger communities, the only time you really hear about criminal justice reform is every 2 years. What's happening down in Austin right now at the legislature. And believe me, when you go down to the legislature, the voices of the rural prosecutors are nowhere near as loud as the ones from the bigger communities. And that's okay, but we all have different values. We all come from different communities. And that's what struck me about going up to SMU and just, picking my head in to say, hey, what is this program about? What is this initiative about? And what can I learn from it to take back to Coryell County to make it a better place, and maybe what I can give back to try to help maybe other jurisdictions through your platform get better.
Thanks.
So that's how mine was just a random, hey, there's a rural justice reform conference in Dallas, and I signed up to go.
Cool. Thanks. Jarvis, how about you? Yeah, you're on mute, my friend.
You're right. I was typing the answers to one of the questions in the.
You got those fast fingers.
And so I think the question was, how did you get hooked up with?
How did you get hooked up with an academic institution? And I'll piggyback on something that Dustin said, which is what made you think to reach out in the first place? You know, he saw an invitation, come to this conference. What propelled you, and how'd you pick your partner?
So I think what propels me, that question started in 2008. So many people don't know, but back in 2008, there was a district attorney's race in Harris County, Texas, where this is the year that Barack Obama was running for president, that there were some emails that circulated at that time. And internally between the DA at the time and another person that were racist in nature. Because of that, Texas District and County Attorney Association started, and I was one of the first people. I was in that inaugural class of the Diversity, Recruitment, and Retention Committee. That was new for us at that time. At that time, we had been talking about introducing numbers and looking at data about things like bias and race and what are these issues. I was an assistant at the time. I didn't know, basically, I was just still trying to figure out where to stand. And I'd learned about it. I started reading about it and seeing other places that did certain things. So you started reading about Milwaukee and Manhattan and things like that. So it's always been an interest of mine. When George Floyd had just renewed that. And so for me, I am lucky because I have a world-class university right here in my town with 70 or 65,000 people. And so I knew a friend who had a colleague that was interested. I read some of their work and they said, hey, would you mind helping us out in this particular area? There was a person in the chat that asked, why not use someone like Vera Institute? And I read some of their stuff and read some of their political positions and things like that about criminal justice reform. I think they do good work. For me, I just wanted somebody that was not affiliated with anybody to just look at my data and tell me what was going on so that I could make a decision that was based just on what I had in front of me and not anything else. So that's the reason. I think they do really good work. I saw what they did in the reports in Charlotte and in Milwaukee, but for me, I just wanted somebody that can look at it locally and tell me, hey, yes, you have a problem, here's what it is, or here's how you try to fix it.
So in your case, really an appearance of neutrality where you felt like you were getting data, but not position.
Yes.
Not obviously. Andrea, so you're hooked up now with Duke and Brandon Garrett there.
Yeah, when I ran in my race, I had a very strong vision for the kind of reforms that I wanted to make. I think that we were a little bit ahead of the curve on these issues in terms of cash bail and racial justice and domestic violence. And I'm part of Fair and Just Prosecution, which is a national organization of prosecutors, people that are trying to do things differently, and Fair and Just Prosecution hooked me up with Duke University. They've been a great resource.
So interestingly, because Andrea, you and I have, I think, been on a couple of Fair and Just calls. It's another organization that's very heavily weighted toward urban DA's offices, right? And I don't know, it's I think partly because that's where some of those DAs started, and it's begun to expand, right? And increasingly a focus on lots of other sized offices, the ones that are less apparent. Let me say, if I can, a couple of words for those folks who are out there on the webinar who are DAs practicing in small or tribal or rural communities and who may be wondering what the opportunities are. In case it hasn't already been clear, most universities have someone who will love your data and your stories, right? And even if you're in a very small office, Dusty size, 4 or 5, trust me, we're interested. If you don't know who to talk to, come to the Deason Center. We're happy to try and help you find the right partner. If it's not something we can help you partner with ourselves, we want you to have the support and partnership you need. And there really is enormous momentum gathering about recognizing that you're not going to change criminal justice nationally if you only change it in a few big cities, right? That's not going to be a successful approach. For those of you who are wondering, well, what does a university or a nonprofit partner want? I can tell you generally that folks are going to want to talk to you about what kind of data systems do you have in your office? How willing are your team to maybe participate in some appropriately sized efforts? No one's going to ask your team to spend an hour a day filling out forms when they've got, 8 hours of court time that they need to put in. But what is it that you think your team can reasonably support? What are your priorities? And how do your priorities line up with the research priorities of the organizational partner that you're talking to in the university context? In the nonprofit context, as Jarvis mentioned, with someplace like Vera or Fair and Just, right? You may have a partner who comes to the table with a particular position about the size of the criminal justice system or the direction it should be moving in, and who's interested in partnering in innovations that move that agenda forward, where the agenda is a shared agenda between your office and the nonprofit. And so both things are possible. You can sometimes find collaborations that are both university and nonprofit, getting together with the DA's office and doing some work. I should also point out, for those of you that are thinking, oh, I don't know how I'd feel about it all being public, it doesn't always have to be. For those of you that might be interested in doing some studies, but don't know that you're quite ready to have all your information shared publicly, you can find partners. We've done this at the Deason Center, who will study your data, give you information about it, and who will publish on your data, but do it anonymously. Some of you may have seen, we just put out a publication about screening and charging in mid-size offices. I think the smallest office had 20 lawyers and the largest had 80. Those are in 3 different states, 3 different jurisdictions. They are anonymous. They will remain forever anonymous. We will never share their identities. But we did learn a lot from that study. We're publishing the information, and the study sites learned a lot from that study, I hope, and we'll continue to learn from those studies. So there are lots of opportunities out there, and I would encourage anyone who's listening on this call to feel free to reach out to us or to your local university. Or if you want to try and reach out to one of our fabulous panelists, you can let us know and we'll try and put you in touch with them as well. Is there anything on that topic that I should say that I haven't, panelists? Anything that do you want to emphasize or?
Oh, all I would say is that I think that's being in the, I remember when we first started this back in 2008, that was one of the core concerns, I think, of, there were a couple of prosecutors at the time that were like, look, I think this is a good idea. However, I want to be able to change this, and I don't want it used as, a political weapon. And so I think at the time, I don't know if people knew about those things, that was 12 or so years ago, that you could do it, you could work on those things internally and say, hey, somebody's going to work with you to publish this, try to make it better, and not have someone who is, for lack of a better term, opportunistic, to try and just kind of bludgeon you over the head when you're trying to do better at the time. So I think that's really good for prosecutors who are just in it, not for a step up, but for a way to do justice in a way that is, for lack of a better term, fair and just.
Yeah. Andrea?
I try to cultivate a culture of learning and, no blame, no shame, and do that within my office. We certainly make high stakes decisions every day. But if we're going to change the racism in our system, if we're going to change the sexism in our system, then we have to be able to gather numbers and to be truthful and honest about it. And we need communities, though, that will support us in those efforts.
Yeah. And let me say on that point that another thing that a good partner will do for you is a good partner will strategize with you about how to get buy-in with your staff. I've spent a lot of my most recent career doing data evangelism in defender offices, which is my background. And defenders don't like keeping time or reporting their stats out any more than prosecutors do, I promise. And so one of the big pieces has been sitting down with folks who work really hard at really hard jobs and saying, I know you do the best you can. I know you want to do better, and we're bringing folks in to help you do better. And it's not to add to your workload. It's to help support your work and really helping people in your staffs and on your lines see how that's going to change their lives for the better and the people they serve, how this research is going to help the people they serve. You know, Dusty's got folks, they're seeing it themselves, right? Firsthand, immediate, right away. They know what's happening. I think when you're collecting data, it can be much harder to keep your staff engaged and help them see what the benefit's going to be for themselves and their communities. And a good partner will help you explain that to your team, help get your team engaged in and excited about that process. And like Andrea said, create that learning community. And that's been at least my experience where I've seen research really, really succeed in helping the larger knowledge community, but the office in particular that's dug in and made that investment has been where the folks who have their boots on the ground know that this is being done to support them and not to hurt them. So I just saw someone throw me another question. And the question was, what is particularly unique to these innovations that makes them rural? And I think I'd flip the question around and say, why is it that these are innovations that work in rural spaces? Because I think our position here at the Deason Center is it may not be that there's something particularly unique. We don't know. Most of the time, what we're doing is trying to ram urban innovations down rural and suburban people's throats, right? And we don't ever go looking for what smaller and rural communities are offering. And so we miss all these fabulous innovations. And so part of what we're trying to do is generate that conversation. That's kind of our position at the Deason Center. But let me turn it over to y'all and ask. Dusty, I saw you just click on your mic there.
Yeah, I don't really necessarily see as it uniquely rural. I mean, I think it's really, if you consider the idea that I got maps from me being in Africa, co-locating with the United Nations in South Sudan, I don't really see that as uniquely Coryell County or uniquely Gatesville. I think that any number of district attorneys or assistants or anyone that has the ability to make change in their office can use their life experiences and try to find ways to make things better. Because I think consistent across the board, I think we began the conversation with this is we just want to make the right call. And the only way we can make the right call is being as informed and educated as humanly possible. And then we make that call consistent with our community values. And so I think that's when we're talking about being uniquely different, rural versus urban, a lot of times people have to pause and reflect that the elected DAs are generally going to be a reflection of their locality's values. You may be in a jurisdiction where they're not persuasively excited about prosecuting illegal narcotics, but you may live in a jurisdiction where they do. And so that's the unique factor when it comes to, I think when you're stepping back again, getting that 30,000-foot view and trying to understand urban versus rural. It's not the issues that are that much different. It's just that understanding the district attorneys and the people trying to affect the change are operating under different values, and they're trying to do it consistent with what their community expects because that's what they voted them in to do. So I don't really see it as a urban versus rural when it comes to innovative ideas and trying to make it change. Now, this looks specifically at maps real quick. I think it would be a real big challenge for a jurisdiction like Harris County to create a panel to evaluate every one of their minority defendants in their felony courts. But that's because their demographics are different than Coryell County. I mean, in 2000, the African-American community was only 20% of my community. It's probably about the same, maybe even a little less. So it's not as challenging for my small little office to consider anywhere from 10 to 20 cases a month because that's about what it makes up right now. And so there would be some significant challenges for an urban office to create a whole nother floor to consider all the minority cases. And that would be a tremendous stress on resources and depending on the commitment of the community. So I don't really see a big difference when it comes to urban versus rural when it comes to innovation. I think what it comes down to is it a reflection of your local community values and can it fit in within those values?
And within your scale, right? Because what you just said is it's got to fit within your local scale.
Yes.
And part of what we want to highlight here today is that innovation happens in rural, small, mid-sized places. It ain't just in the cities. Jarvis, I see you're ready to go.
I was going to say that, it's a lot harder in a big jurisdiction to get to the troops, and get that message down to the troops and make something go. So in a smaller jurisdiction, if you have an idea, many times you're the face of that idea and you can go and do stuff. So for example, for us, I wanted to start a Citizens Prosecution Academy for one of the sole purposes, so people can come in and be absolutely free. And if you have issues with the criminal justice system, you can see here is what we do, right? And I started off, I have what I call my cruise director who takes them through 9 weeks. And, but I'm there, I'm talking about capital punishment, I'm talking about the general overview of the cases, and it allows the community in a smaller jurisdiction to see their elected up close and personal in a ways that many times there's a lot of different layers of access you have to get through in order to get to your elected in bigger communities. So I think that some of these innovations can move quicker, and you see the fruit of it better in smaller communities, because you can see, yes, this worked and it worked really fast, or no, it didn't work and we know really fast, so we can shift, we can change, and then we can make it better.
Yeah, thanks, Jarvis, for that. And for all those researchers out there who are thinking about these issues, the answer is yes, 100%. I mean, we have a tendency, I think, to think about somehow that urban jurisdictions are where everything's happening, but the reality is you can be nimble in a rural community or smaller community. You can move quickly and adapt quickly, which means that they are quite potentially real hotspots for innovation. The big critique that we have at the center of what academia does is we don't know what innovation looks like in rural communities because nobody's asking. I'm going to bet money that no one else has come knocking on Dusty's door. And I'm going to bet money that, nobody's knocking down Jarvis's or Andrea's either, right? And the point is, shame on us. We need to recognize that this is the bread and butter of where criminal justice happens in our country. And if we're not asking what small tribal and rural communities can teach everybody else about criminal justice, then we're missing out. Andrea, you want to say something on this?
I would say that I concur with those points 100%. And in my community, I'm one of 3 countywide elected officials. We have one hospital system. We have one superior court. So, we're under-resourced. So we have to work together so that we can solve these problems. So the successes that I've had have been by giving all the players a skin in the game. And we can do that because we're smaller, we're more nimble, and we are more reliant on one another.
Thank you. Well, we are right at 4:15. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to say thank you so much to our amazing panelists. What a great panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this has helped not only showcase these amazing innovative efforts, but really highlighted the importance of opening up our conversations to include small tribal and rural communities who have so much to offer our national conversation on these incredibly important topics. Be well, folks. Be safe. Mask up.